Okay, so this is the last video in the sequence, or in the series that we're doing, this sequence of videos on the sequence approach. And I want it to be kind of an overview of the sequences, kind of go back over. And I'm going to do this by using a third film and go through the sequences in this film to sort of recap what we've been talking about. And the film I'd like to use is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's a film by Milos Forman, and it is an extremely good film, a well-told story. It won the Academy Award, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest stopping the video at this point and go watch the film. Enjoy it, and then come back to this video and see how this film sort of breaks down into the sequences and how the sequences really help us understand how the story is put together, how it's structured, and ultimately how it's told, so that the audience forms a complete story in their mind, and also how the storyteller decides what to tell the audience and when to tell it to them. We can't do, and we certainly don't want to give the audience everything right up front. Part of this is about piquing their curiosity and engaging them in the way that makes them want to go further into the story. So we're going to begin with sequence A and see more or less how we might hook the audience and how we introduce the main character, the ordinary world of this main character, and how they how we establish some inciting incident in terms of establishing some conflict. Now, the film begins with McMurphy, who's played by Jack Nicholson, arriving at a mental institution, and he comes from a prison. He's basically been incarcerated, and he's figured out that if I can it's better to spend this time in the loony bin than to spend it in jail. It's almost like he sees it as a free ride, a vacation, a resort of sorts, I guess. So, it establishes right up front what his main objective is, which is to beat the system. And that objective is also what forms the dramatic question in the story: is will he beat the system? Will he spend the rest of his time, or his sentence, as it were? Will he spend it in the luxury of this mental institution, or will he get sent back to prison? And that's basically it. And the rest of the conflict in the story is kind of governed by McMurphy's character, his flaws, and also his positive traits as well. And so here it is, sequence A. He arrives at the mental institution. We meet him for the first time, and right away we understand that he's the main character. And as far as a hook is concerned, we see this man who is handcuffed arriving at this mental hospital, which is a very unique environment, full of really interesting characters, and I think we're immediately interested in the story just because it's something we've never quite seen before, and we're really interested to find out what's happening, and why this guy's here, why there are handcuffs on him, and whatnot. So he arrives and he kind of takes a tour of the hospital, and we kind of meet the cast of characters that end up being very important to the story later on, as he makes friends with these people and becomes personally involved in in helping them out, in sort of helping them see life the way he sees life, and see if he can't, make a difference in their life. Not that that's his objective, but I think he kind of takes that on later on in the film. Here he's having a meeting with the warden of the hospital, and this ends up being the inciting incident of the film, when the warden challenges him with the idea that he doesn't think he's crazy. And that is something that threatens his ordinary world at this point, which is to complete his sentence in the mental institution. That's what his ordinary world is. That's what he wants it to be. That's the equilibrium he sets out to have. It's a little bit different than we've seen in other films. His ordinary world, started off to be, he's in prison. He makes a decision. He's He's got a plan. I'm going to beat the system. So he arrives at the hospital. His plan's working, and equilibrium is set. This is what he wants. And the warden presents, a challenge to that. We don't think you're crazy, so we're going to keep you on. We're going to assess you for a little bit and make a determination whether or not you really need to be here. And so that gives Nicholson, off into sequence B, which is a debate. How is he going to react to that and hold on to his ordinary world? And that objective is simply that to prove that he's crazy, to prove that he belongs there. So the warden releases him, and he joins the general population, or I guess in this particular ward, and he meets all these characters, and particularly his nemesis in the film, Nurse Ratched. And what he quickly discovers is that Nurse Ratched has quite a handle on the situation. Everybody's intimidated by her, and heck, I'm intimidated by her. She seems like a really sort of cold and mean person. And I think what McMurphy wants to do is establish his authority. He wants to have his way. He wants things to go the way he wants them to go. And the only person that really seems to be standing in his way is Nurse Ratched. So he presents a challenge, and we'll notice that this pretty much occurs at let's see, where does he do it? Right here in this card game. He basically says, I bet that I can put a bug so far up her ass she doesn't, I don't know. He says, he proves to everybody else that he can get to her, that he can beat her. And, that establishes an objective right away that's going to send, it's a point of no return, because once he gets on her bad side, and we'll find out later that there's really no turning that around. He can't back up and say, I'm sorry, Nurse Ratched, I was wrong, and I'll behave. Once she gets it in her mind that he's going to challenge her and challenge her authority, there's no turning back for her. So this is where we kind of launch into sequence C, and sequence C is McMurphy's first real challenge. Here he's making a complaint about the music. He doesn't like the music that's being played, and he would like to watch the World Series on the television set and suggests that it would be good for everybody else, and Nurse Ratched refuses to do it. At some point, she tries to be quite diplomatic about it and suggests that they take a vote, and everybody, some people raise their hands and some people don't raise their hands, and McMurphy realizes that all these guys are so intimidated. No wonder that they're nuts. They're oppressed. So Nurse Ratched refuses to actually go through and allow the screening of the World Series to actually take place. And so this immediate objective to try to take control of the situation and prove that he is has more authority or is better than Nurse Ratched fails. What happens in sequence D is, here at the end of the sequence is sequence C is, after he's, failed at trying to get the World Series on, he tries to prove to the guys that, his next objective is to just, break out and go see the World Series. And his plan is to, lift up this I don't know what you call it, a sink, a water spout, I don't know what it is. He tries to lift this thing up and throw it through the window, and he's going to go through, and ultimately he fails at that as well. The next sequence is ultimately when he shows up at this another meeting, and he's trying to get together the votes and for one more attempt to try to watch the World Series, and he can't seem to get it in time, but in fact he does get that final vote and tries to show Nurse Ratched that hey, you said that we could vote. I got all the votes I needed. I got a majority. And Nurse Ratched sort of pulls a little rule and pulls a rug out from under him and says, well, the vote is closed now, and you'll have to try again some other time. And this really gets under McMurphy's skin. He can't seem to get his way, and I think he's very unhappy about the fact that she's changing the rules on him. So he goes through this little routine of pretending like they're watching the World Series, and he gets all these guys involved and sort of disrupts the order in the ward, and that really gets under Nurse Ratched's skin. And this is escalating the conflict in the sense that he does sort of take control of the ward for a very brief moment, and really establishes in Nurse Ratched's mind how McMurphy is her nemesis, and she's going to then work a lot harder in dealing with him and how to deal with him. So he shows up at a meeting with the warden again, and this is where they really tried to figure out. McMurphy complains about Nurse Ratched, and the other psychiatrists in the ward are really questioning whether or not he's dangerous or not, whether or not he's crazy. So the evaluation is going to continue. He's sort of past this round in a sense that he's succeeding in staying in the ward at this point. But there are consequences to that, and they are certainly going to play out as the film continues. So, here we are moving into sequence E. Well, this is sort of the end of sequence D here. He steals a bus with all of his buds on it, and he takes them on a fishing expedition. And, the fishing expedition, they go out, they try to catch some fish, and he feels like, he's sort of immune to anything that might happen to him. As long as they think he's crazy and he's in the loony bin, they're not going to take him back to prison. They're crazy. They're going to take him back to the loony bin. I mean, what are the consequences? He is totally ignorant of what could possibly happen to him. He's totally ignorant of the rules of the game at this point, and so are the audience. And the storyteller is very purposefully withholding this information and saving it for a reveal, which, of course, is going to happen at the midpoint of the film, which happens at the end of the sequence. And so, he takes the boat out, he takes them fishing, and this scene is a really... hold on, before we get to that. This scene is really great because it establishes, a moment where, he and the rest of the guys in the ward bond. We like McMurphy for what he's sharing with them. He's giving them something that they can't get in the ward. He is, making friends with them. He seems to protect them. He's very self-centered, and, he brings along his girlfriend Candy with him. And really, the idea is that, he's going to go fishing, he's going to do whatever he wants, he's going to get out of that crazy place, and he's going to, have a good time with his girlfriend. And it seems very self-centered, but as the rest of the guys kind of lose control of the boat, as a fish gets, hooked on the line, McMurphy kind of ditches, his initial objective, which is to have a good time with his girlfriend, and goes out and gets caught up in the adventure with everybody else, and it kind of forms this bonding moment. And in a way that helps the audience empathize with McMurphy. They understand him a little bit more, and they become to like him even more, because he seems to be bonding with all these other characters that we also like. I mean, they might be crazy, but they're kind of endearing in a really innocent way. And so this is helping the audience really sort of form a bond. Once they get back, McMurphy, we have the midpoint of the film, which is the shower room scene, and it's where he finds out something that he didn't know before, and is really, really, the conflict is much deeper than he expected at the midpoint of this movie. And that is when he discovers that he doesn't get out of the loony bin in 68 days when he served his time. He thought when he went in that he would just serve out the remainder of his sentence in the loony bin. And what he finds out is that they can keep him there as long as they want. If they want to keep him there for another 2 years, they can if they see fit. And this is a real threat to McMurphy because, for one reason, this stands between him and beating the system. And, also his strategy has been to put a bug up Nurse Ratchet's ass, and he realizes that is working so much against him that if Nurse Ratchet decides that he's not fit to be released from the mental institution, he's never going to get out of there, and which is definitely not what he wants. Which ultimately his what's motivating him is he wants his freedom back. So he finds that out at this in this sequence here. And, he decides that at this point, he's going to try to be a nice guy, and he's going to try to, play by the rules now. He's going to change his tune. He's going to change his game. He's going to try to hold on to that objective to beat the system. And so now he's going to be a sweetheart. He's going to try to, turn back and be nice and play by Nurse Ratchet's rules. And he finds that, that's a lot harder to do than he originally thought. So things get kind of out of hand at the next meeting in a little group therapy session. And one of the patients loses his temper and starts having a hissy fit. And, McMurphy, and he's being rational at this point. He's going to try to solve the problem. He's going to try to calm the ward down. He's not going to let Nurse Ratchet handle it, as he should have. He tries to solve the problem himself. So, as mayhem ensues, people get drug out, and he smashes the window. He grabs the cigarettes, is what the other patient really was complaining about, and then he gets in a fight with some of the orderlies, and that ends this sequence E. And he's basically moving on to the next step, which is electroshock therapy. So there he is. He's waiting to go through some electroshock therapy, and I don't even think the audience really knows what this is yet. The storyteller's really good about sort of keeping the cards close to the chest, and only giving the audience the information when they need to know it, getting them engaged in a question, and sort of teasing their curiosity until the moment needs to be revealed, and moving on to the next bit. So McMurphy is waiting, and as he's waiting to see what happens next, he discovers that the chief is also trying to beat the system. And he really forms a bond here, and we've really enjoyed the chief at this point. McMurphy is succeeding in sort of communicating with the chief who nobody thought anybody could communicate with him. He was mute and dumb, and didn't talk and didn't seem to understand anything. And McMurphy discovers that there's actually nothing wrong with him. That the chief is there just like him to try to beat the system, to find a safe place for himself, a way of just sort of surviving. And we don't quite understand why the chief is, what he's running away from or what he's trying to protect himself from. We discover it later. But, he goes into this therapy session, and he comes back to the meeting, and, he goes right back to his game again to try to, to play the game and be a sweetheart. But I think at this point, he decides that, the second culmination here, which is the end of sequence F, that he's got another plan. He's going to stop trying to playing the game anymore. He's not going to try to beat the system anymore. So the dramatic question gets answered. Not necessarily in the audience's mind, because they don't really know what's going on in terms of what his next move is. But for the storyteller knows that McMurphy has now given up on trying to beat the system and play the game and play out, and serve the rest of his sentence there. He's now going to try to escape. That's his plan now. that is the second culmination where all of these storylines come together in terms of what everybody wants, and he's now got a new plan, he's got a new objective. So, he, with the help of a couple of ladies, he's going to have them come over, he's going to throw a party and try to distract the nurse who's on watch, while he steals the keys, opens a window, and tries to escape. And so we watch all that go down, but in the meantime, a new complication arises as Billy, who is kind of the most innocent and loving character, who's very troubled, but we know that he has a crush on Candy, McMurphy's girlfriend, and so he decides he's going to give Billy a chance to experience love in a little more carnal way, something that Billy wants really badly. And we know that McMurphy is really cares about these guys. I mean, it's an odd way to show it, but nevertheless, he really cares about these guys, and so he sends Billy off to have a good time with Candy, after the party. And so that ends sequence G, when McMurphy, waiting for Billy to finish his experience, he falls asleep. Instead of escaping when he has the opportunity, he falls asleep. And that opportunity passes by. And so that's the end of sequence G. Now, we haven't arrived at necessarily the climax of the film yet. It's definitely a turning point. And I wouldn't say that necessarily McMurphy made a decision to fall asleep, but he made the decision to delay his escape, allowing for the consequence, which is after, a long night and some drinking, he's going to fall asleep. So, sequence H arrives, and that's when Nurse Ratched, shows up at the ward and sees what's going on, and sees what has happened, and decides that she's going to clamp down, close the window, and, basically, eradicate McMurphy's opportunity to escape. But McMurphy's not going to give up without a fight, so he tries to fight his way out before they can, close the window, and something terrible happens. She discovers Billy, and we learn a little bit of backstory that we didn't know. We didn't know that Nurse Ratched knows Billy's mother, and she does something quite terrible, which is to threaten Billy with telling his mother what has happened. And to understand Billy and his character and to go into his psychology, he is I don't know. I don't want to necessarily be an armchair psychiatrist here, but that this is something Billy really doesn't want. This kind of gets at the core of what makes Billy a very suicidal person. The idea that he's ashamed of himself, his self-worth, or whatever, and so he basically commits suicide as all of this is happening. So this sequence culminates with McMurphy getting revenge on Nurse Ratched for what he sees as her fault, and in a sense it kind of is her fault, and he tries to choke her to death and nearly succeeds if the orderlies hadn't stepped in. So that's essentially the end of the road for McMurphy, although the audience doesn't really know that yet. Milos Forman is really, really good at withholding what actually unfolds, piquing the audience interests into seeing what happens. So that sequence H ends. Now, sequence H, aren't we at the end of the sequence approach? Aren't we at the end of the movie? Well, essentially we are, because Murphy doesn't escape. Murphy, what happens to Murphy next is, because of the violence of what happened, because of the assessment that everybody's been paying close attention to, and what was set up at more or less at the midpoint when they decide, he might not be crazy, but he's definitely dangerous. And so what ends up happening is he goes upstairs and they perform a lobotomy on McMurphy. They basically, cut open, cut open his skull and remove a part of his frontal lobe. This is all expository from me, by the way, but you kind of get this visually in the next sequence, and we'll call it sequence I, okay? Because the audience still has questions that are open. The audience needs to know how the story really has already ended for McMurphy. And so that's what kind of provides this sort of coda to the sequence approach here. And these are the guys talking about, rumors about what happened to McMurphy. And of course, Chief, his main buddy, the guy that, he thought he was going to escape with, and his partner in the ward, discovers McMurphy and realizes what has happened to him, that the lobotomy has happened, and after that there is no escaping. What has happened to McMurphy is permanent. It can't be changed. There's definitely no going back. And he is not going to beat the system at this point, and nor is he really going to gain his freedom. He's going to spend the rest of his days in this mental ward, which the chief knows is not what he wants. And so the last moment is the chief basically smothering McMurphy with a pillow. And, poetically, he's setting him free. It's kind of ironic at the end of this film, which makes it such a good story, which makes it such a good telling, is that, in the end, McMurphy does escape. McMurphy escapes with the chief's help, and he is freed from the ward in death. And the chief then uses this moment to take the opportunity and to give himself some strength to lift that faucet, spout thing himself and throw it through the window and escape. And so there you have it. It's the sequence approach. And more than anything else, I think that we need to appreciate the fact that there is a structure to the way the story is told, that it isn't just sort of a random sequence of events that sort of wanders from the beginning to the end. It's a very deliberate telling. And each sort of sequence that we went through in the film is kind of like a story in and of itself, in terms of the character taking on an immediate objective to try to reach that, their super objective in a way. McMurphy's is to beat the system and gain his freedom. And everything he does in the film, from one sequence to the next, is in pursuit of that super objective. And, we get to the end of this film, and it's quite a poetic ending to the story. Another thing that that this film really sort of demonstrates is that not all characters change. The idea that in a good story a character changes at the end, that's not necessarily true. And especially in this case, it's powerful that McMurphy doesn't change. We, the audience, must understand that the character should change, and we should understand how that character should change. That is what's really important, that the character has an internal conflict, that the character stands in his own way as much as anything else in the film, and that sort of gives the audience a clear sense of what needs to change in the character. But in this case, in this sort of tragic ending, McMurphy doesn't change. And but that isn't the end of the story. There is still hope, and in his death, McMurphy's spirit, his spirit to survive, his spirit to overcome his circumstances, is what ultimately gives the chief his strength to escape himself. And there is a sense of freedom. There is a sense that the system has been beaten at the end of the film, just not by McMurphy per se. So there we have One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, broken down into the sequences, and hopefully this gives you a clear illustration of more or less the structure. Now, obviously we didn't go through everything, we didn't hit every little story point along the way, but we certainly hit the major ones in terms of those story points that form the beginning and end of each sequence. And hopefully we also focused on how the character had a pretty immediate objective within each sequence, and which was governing the action in that sequence, from the beginning of that sequence to the end of that sequence. And that's the way it should work. And it lays out a clear sequence of action that has that causality to it, that we can see that what is happening to a character at any given moment is a result of choices that character has made. That's really important in any kind of storytelling, that we really focus on the character, the choices that they make, and the consequences of those choices, the action, reaction, structure. That is ultimately what structure is. We talk about 3-act structure. You can read a book. I think his name is Brad Snyder or Brian Snyder. I don't know. He's got his Blake Snyder. He's got his own little beat sheet, a way of structuring a film. The sequence approach is yet another way of sequencing a film, and we all call that structure. But ultimately, structure occurs in the audience's mind in terms of what they understand from one moment to the next, and how those moments, not scenes, not sequences, but moments, are connected in a causal way. And that, how each character has their own objective, and how these different storylines, these lines of conflicts, how characters confront each other and become opposition for each other. We'll call them forces of antagonism, in the sense that it's not just one thing in McMurphy's way. It's a lot of things culminating to stand in his way as he tries to reach his objective in the film. So hopefully this gives you I guess a means of structuring your story. Each sequence, if you're working on your own idea, each sequence should be about 5 to 7 scenes, that each scene, or each of these groups of scenes, 5 to 7 scenes, should take the character from whatever plot point begins the sequence. In the beginning, it's the hook at sequence A, and 5 to 7 scenes that take the main character from the hook to the inciting incident. Because that's the way I think we should sort of go through the sequences and develop an outline for the film. It's an iterative process, and the way we need to begin this process, and it's funny that now I'm ending this video with where you should begin, but there's some truth to this. The first thing you should do is decide where you're going. So you have a character, you have a situation. Where does it go? Where does the film end up in the end? And ultimately, what that helps you decide, first and foremost, is what the main conflict is. So that you have a character, a situation, and at the end of the film, they've overcome something. That's in your mind establishing what the main conflict is. And because you know the end of the film, now you can start plotting how the character gets there. So what do? You begin with the hook. Where do I begin? Then you decide what's the inciting incident that introduces the some force of the main conflict to threaten the character's ordinary world. Then you get to the point of no return, where the character makes a decision after which there's really no turning back. And then you move to the midpoint of the film. We kind of skipped over a sequence, but you get to the midpoint of the film. That's the next plot point you should decide on. Each plot point, making sure you're making a direct approach to the climax of the film that you've already decided. So you got the midpoint that reveals the conflict to be much bigger than they expected, because you've been withholding some information from the audience about how deep the conflict really is and how big the problem is. And then you have the resurrection moment, or the second culmination, where the main character, the dramatic question is answered, but now the story is personal. The character the stakes have been raised in a way that the character is personally involved in seeing a new objective and launching into this final approach toward the climax of the film. So you decide these major plot points first, these turning points, and when you have that in your mind, that it is a clear path. Think of each plot point as a stone and a path, and each stone is placed directly in front of each other, so that you make a direct course from beginning to end. When you feel like that those plot points are put together in that way, that's when you take those plot points and you start using the sequence approach to figure out, okay, how do I get from point A to point B? How do I get from the hook to the inciting incident? That's when you can decide what 5 to 7 scenes get me to that point. It makes this process so much easier. You've sort of taken a huge amount of story, and you've organized it in a way that you, as the storyteller, can just focus on one sequence at a time. You know where it ends. You know where the sequence begins. You've already decided where it ends. All I've got to think about is how to get from those 5 to 7 scenes that take me from the beginning of the sequence to the end of the sequence. And then once you figure that out, once you make those decisions and you outline that, you move on to the next sequence. You don't have to think about the whole film. You've already got a lot of this stuff figured out. All you got to figure out is how to get to the very next plot point. That is ultimately a process. This is a practical way of developing a story idea, and it takes many different iterations. Once you get through one draft of an outline, you'll learn a lot more about your story. You'll see where the problems are. You see what doesn't make sense. Maybe you got a line of conflict that kind of never gets answered. You might find that you started a line of conflict somewhere and realize that it doesn't really end up anywhere. It doesn't really serve as opposition anywhere in the story. It doesn't culminate with the other storylines, so you just get rid of it. You get rid of that line of conflict, and you go back to the beginning and you figure out, all right, I'm going to go through this process again and make sure and tighten up the story so that not only one scene follows the next in a logical, causal way, but that each moment follows the next in a logical, causal way. And that's where you get down to the real structure of the story. And it's those moments that, if they connect and they're causal, that's what the audience is able to follow. That's when they have real understanding, that they can see it on the screen, and it's forming the story in their mind in a clear way. And I'm just touching on some very, very developmental ideas. There's certainly a whole host of other strategies about how to tell the story, when to introduce a line of conflict, when to bring that several lines of conflict into a culminating moment. When do I do that? That's where there's a lot of variables in the storytelling. That's part of the exploration and ultimately part of the fun of figuring out how to tell a story and how to do it well. So that wraps up this series. I hope it was informative and gives you at least some inspiration in terms of how to approach quite a daunting task, which is to figure out how to write a screenplay and write it well. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching, and good night.